Hello and welcome back to the Death Row and Executions channel, and welcome to the first episode of this new year, 2026. I hope you all enjoyed the holiday season and everything goes well for you in the new year. If this is your first time visiting this channel, my name is Paco Rivera and I present cases about the next scheduled execution to take place in the United States, with a backstory of what got the death row inmate sentenced to death. Unlike most other YouTube channels covering this topic, I do not offer my opinion on whether the death penalty is a good thing or a bad thing. I try to present unbiased reporting on that particular matter. However, if I truly believe the condemned death row inmate is guilty, I will not hesitate to point that out with all the facts of the case that I had studied. By the way, you can also follow me on Facebook for updates and more death row news. There will be a link to my Facebook in the description below. Also, check out my other channel here on YouTube called The Maximum Sentence, where I cover recent crimes and convictions. There will also be a link for that. As I have been doing every year, I am going to begin the first episode of the year with a very brief recap for just a couple minutes of the outcomes of all scheduled executions of the previous year. In the year 2025, there was a total of 53 executions scheduled in the United States. And a video of every one of those cases appeared on this channel. Now, remember that if a scheduled execution got canceled before I had a chance to create a video, that does not count here as a scheduled executions. They might appear in other databases, but not in my stats. Once again, before the year had started, Ohio and several other states had a number of executions scheduled for 2025, and very soon after the year started, many of them disappeared. They vanished off the list. The death row inmate either got a stay of execution or it was moved to a later year. So I don't count those as a scheduled execution. Of the 53 scheduled executions in 2025, 47 were in fact executed in 11 different states. Florida led by far with the most executions by carrying out 19 of them during the year in that state. Texas had 5, Alabama 5, South Carolina 5, Tennessee 3, Mississippi 2, Indiana 2, Oklahoma 2, Arizona 2, Missouri 1, and Louisiana had 1. Of the 53 executions scheduled, 5 death row inmates were granted a stay and their execution got canceled. Serial killer David Wood in Texas, David Roberts in Alabama, and Ralph Menzies in Arizona, who was scheduled for September 9th and ended up dead anyway 2 months later, while still on death row after being transferred to a hospital where he presumably died from natural causes, according to the Department of Corrections in Arizona. Also stayed was Robert Robeson in Texas. His scheduled execution has been stayed multiple times over the years. The 5th execution that got stayed was Stacey Humphreys in Georgia. And finally, Tremaine Wood in Oklahoma, who was scheduled to be executed on November 13th, found out on that day that Governor Kevin Stitt called off the execution and commuted his death sentence to life without parole. Today we are going to talk about the first execution to take place this year, if by chance another execution isn't suddenly scheduled before that, which happens to be yet another classic case of a love triangle gone wrong. Something quite common, it seems. I believe I've presented a few of these cases already over the years. Of course, only the names, details, and circumstances will all be different. On April 30, 1998, Charles Victor Thompson kicked in the door of his ex-girlfriend's apartment and shot both her and her new boyfriend. There have been several documentaries on this case. I recently watched an episode on Netflix of a series called I Am a Killer, an episode called Intended Evil. And Charles Thompson was interviewed while on death row. After watching this episode, it solidified my decision as to why I refuse to interview death row inmates, because the proven lies coming out of his mouth all throughout the interview was so obvious. Charles Thompson was originally charged with manslaughter in the killing of his ex-girlfriend's new boyfriend, Darren Cain. Manslaughter because both men were known to be fighting with each other. And aggravated assault for shooting his ex-girlfriend, Dennise Hayslip. But when Dennise died in the hospital 6 days later from the wound that she had sustained, and additional details about what happened that night became known, the double murder statute went into effect, making it a capital case, warranting the death penalty. Thompson has said that he shouldn't have been sentenced to death for two reasons. One, that he didn't kill Dennise. It was the hospital's fault when she did not receive proper treatment to save her life. Even the family of Dennise Hayslip agreed that the hospital had screwed up, and they sued the hospital for malpractice and wrongful death. However, a court would later determine that the hospital did nothing wrong. According to the reports, doctors were unable to keep an airway stable because of the massive injury to Dennise's trachea, her windpipe. As doctors prepped for surgery, she had suffered a period without oxygen and she became brain dead. And two, Thompson's defense had argued that this was a crime of passion, two men fighting over a woman, and therefore not a capital crime. But we'll get into that a bit more later. Several months before the murders, in late 1997, Dennise Hayslip, who had just turned 39 years old in September of that year, met Charles Thompson at a party. Thompson, who everyone referred to as Chuck, moved in with Dennise a few weeks later. He was 27 years old, so Dennise was 39 years old, and he was 27. That year of 1997, Dennise had a 13-year-old son from her divorced husband. The boy's name is Wade, who was also living there in the home. According to the case file, Dennise was living there with her friend and co-worker, Lisa Gonzalez, and her two daughters. So they were all roommates, but the apartment actually belonged to Lisa Gonzalez, and she would later testify at Thompson's murder trial about Thompson and the abuse that she had witnessed in that apartment. I'll get into what she said at the trial a bit later. Now, Charles Thompson had worked in heating and air conditioning installation, electronics, and as an exterminator, but apparently rarely ever went to work, and he was essentially living there for free and being supported by the two women. When Lisa Gonzalez, the roommate, told Thompson one day that he needed to contribute to the expenses, he threw a fit and moved out. Dennise would also later move out and get her own place at the Warden Crossings apartment complex in Houston, and she eventually allowed Thompson to move in with her, but that didn't last long. Not long after Thompson had moved in, young Wade had confided in a youth pastor that was also a friend of the family that his mom and who he called Chuck were always fighting and that there were drugs in the house. The pastor told Wade that he highly suggests that Wade go live with his grandma until things become stable in the home. Wade thought that was a good idea, and he did just that. He went to live with his grandma. Several months later, now 1998, his mom was dead. When his relationship with Dennise went completely downhill, Charles Thompson was forced to move out of her apartment. Aside from his drinking too much and doing drugs, there was domestic abuse. Dennise was seen on multiple occasions by her friends with a black eye and bruises on her neck, and those friends insisted that she get away from him. About the same time, Dennise met a man named Darren Cain, who was a bartender at a restaurant that Dennise often frequented, and they began dating. According to the owner of the restaurant and Darren's boss, a man named Jim Kelly, Darren had called him at home and asked for permission to leave the bar because his girlfriend, who Jim Kelly is also very familiar with as Darren's girlfriend, because his girlfriend Dennise called him saying that Thompson was calling her and making threats and that she was worried. Jim says that he allowed Darren to leave work to go be with Dennise so that she is safe. Darren's boss, Jim Kelly, had described Darren as the total opposite of Charles. He was very friendly with everyone. He was a hard worker, and in his own words, was a man who was going places. He was clean, didn't do drugs, and wasn't an alcoholic like Thompson. He was described by everyone who knew him as an all-around good guy. Sure enough, about 3 o'clock in the morning, while Darren and Dennise were still awake, Thompson shows up extremely intoxicated, yelling at both Darren and Dennise and calling Dennise a whore. That sparked a physical fight between Darren and Thompson, a fight where Darren obviously had the upper hand since Thomas, being drunk, was at a disadvantage, and it resulted in this black eye that Thompson sustained as seen in this picture taken the next day when Thompson was arrested. Meanwhile, a neighbor named Catherine Page called 911 when she heard screaming and fighting. She later went outside and saw Thompson with that black eye. But by that time, things had calmed down. It appears that Thompson, completely overpowered, had showed signs of surrendering to the battle, and that's when Darren, the more compassionate and reasonable of the two, this all-around good guy, had stated words to the effect of, "Look, man, there's no need for this. Come on, let's have a beer together and talk about this situation." And unbelievably, Thompson agreed. Darren told Thompson, "Look, she doesn't want you in her life anymore. You can't force her to love you. It's best to just move on and we can all be friends." Soon after that, Deputy Coker arrived on the scene following the 911 call from the neighbor, and although he could tell something had happened after seeing Thompson's black eye, it appeared to be two men enjoying some time together. Both men explained to the deputy, "Yeah, we got off to a bad start, but everything is good now and nobody wants to press any charges." The deputy, however, didn't want to take any chances and stated that one of them had to leave, which was clearly Thompson, who no longer lives at the home with Dennise, and Darren was an invited guest. The two men shook hands. Yes, they shook hands. And Thompson left. Now, even though Darren would soon be dead, we know all these details about what happened about 3 o'clock in the morning that night because after Thompson left, Darren called his boss, Jim Kelly, and told him all about it and how it was a good thing that Jim allowed Darren to get off work because sure enough, Thompson had showed up and he was drunk and all out of control when he got there. That they had fought but later made up and even drank a beer together, and that Thompson agreed to move on with his life away from Dennise, and that they even shook hands. So everything is okay now. But little did Darren know that everything was not okay. About 6 o'clock in the morning, Thompson showed up at Dennise's apartment again. Maybe sobered up a little by that time, or maybe more drunk, but he showed up there again. He kicked in the door, busted the door open, apparently waking Darren and Dennise, who were now asleep. Darren made his way to the doorway, and Thompson immediately shot him twice in the chest and once in the throat. According to the forensics report and the medical examiner, Thompson shot him again in the back of the neck after Darren was lying face down on the floor. Thompson then sought out Dennise in the apartment. He had reloaded his gun. He pressed the gun to the side of her face, to her cheek, and said, "I can kill you too, B-word." And he fired a shot. Thompson then fled from the scene and threw the gun into a creek and went to the home of a friend named Diane Zernia. Now, before I get into what happened next, I'm going to tell you what Thompson said happened that night when he was interviewed for various documentaries. I really shouldn't bother because it's so ridiculous, but here it goes. Thompson said that he had called first and told Dennise that he was on his way to her home to retrieve some clothing still in her apartment that he needed for work. He said when he got there, he was in a room getting stuff from a closet. He makes no mention of the door that he kicked in, by the way. Well, he said that he then noticed that Darren and Dennise were together in bed. He said that Darren woke up and got a knife to attack him with it. So Thompson was able to retrieve a gun from the closet in the home, and during a struggle with Darren, he fired 2 shots. And that when Dennise tried to break up the fight, another shot went off and accidentally struck Dennise in the face. So one death was self-defense, and the other, eventual death, was an accident that he also blamed on malpractice at the hospital when she died 6 days later. Forensics proved from powder burns that the barrel of the gun was pressed hard up against Dennise's cheek when the gun was fired. Also, Thompson's friend, Diane Zernia, to whose home Thompson fled to after the shootings, would testify at trial that Thompson had told her he had pressed the gun into Dennise's face and said, "I can kill you too, B-word." After Thompson fled, Dennise was severely injured and bloody, but she managed to get up and make her way to the neighbor's home. According to that neighbor, Catherine Page, she heard pounding on the door and Dennise was slumped on the ground, bleeding profusely from her face. Dennise couldn't speak, so she motioned a gun gesture with her hand, pointing at her face, and that is when Catherine knew that she was shot. Catherine called police, and the same deputy that had responded to a disturbance call about 3 o'clock in the morning, Deputy Coker, arrived, and he asked Dennise directly, "Did Charles Thompson come back and shoot you?" And she nodded her head yes. Dennise was airlifted to a hospital. Officer Coker then went into the apartment to see if Thompson was still in there, but upon opening the door, he saw the dead body of Darren Cain right there on the floor, right by the doorway. Police were now on the hunt for Charles Thompson, and reports went out to the media. Back at the home of Diane Zerger, after the shootings, Thompson had already thrown the gun into a creek on his way there. Once there, according to Diane, he fell asleep in her house. In the morning, Diane was watching the news and saw that police were searching for Thompson. He woke up and saw images of Dennise on a gurney being taken to a medical helicopter, and he saw that she was still alive. Well, now he's screwed. Surely his plan, if ever questioned, was to say that he was never there. But that all just went out the window when the woman that he thought was dead, who was obviously still conscious, surely told police who shot her and her boyfriend Darren. Darren then confessed to his friend Diane Zerger what had happened that night. Darren told Diane Zerger that he kicked in the door and that he immediately shot Darren 4 times. He told her how he pressed the gun to Denise's cheek and said, "I can kill you too, B word," and then fired the gun. After speaking to Diane Zerger, Thompson then called his father, who had also seen the news. The dad told his son that he is wanted and to be considered armed and dangerous. The father told Thompson that he is going to pick him up and take him to the police station to turn himself in, because now the plan that he was never at the home of Dennise Hayslip won't work. So he's got to turn himself in and come up with a different story. And he surely came up with some stories, as heard in those death row documentary interviews. But he's got another problem. He had told his friend, Diane Zerger, exactly what had happened. And that's going to screw up his story. So while held in jail, he spoke to several cellmates and tried to hire the cellmates to kill Diane Zerger when they got out. All of them refused, and authorities got wind of the attempted hitman for hire scheme, and an undercover officer, pretending to be another cellmate, had shared a cell with Thompson and recorded audio of Thompson agreeing to pay him $1,500 to kill Diane Zerger. An additional charge of conspiracy to commit murder was added to Thompson's murder charges, and that audio tape was played at his trial. By the way, during that whole hitman for hire situation, Thompson had also drawn a map of where he got rid of the gun that he used to kill Dennise and Darren. Police recovered the murder weapon on July 18th, 1998 in Cypress Creek. The trial happened the following year, in 1999. Charles Victor Thompson was found guilty and sentenced to death. Several years later, while on death row, he filed an appeal that the audio recording of him hiring the undercover officer to kill someone should not have been played at his trial. The reason being that he was already arrested and the man who shared the cell with him was an officer of the law, and that the officer was required to issue Thompson his Miranda rights before discussing the plot to kill someone. You might think that's funny, but the court agreed. The judicial system can be really strange sometimes. Anyway, Thompson wasn't granted a new trial, but he was granted a new sentencing hearing in the hopes of getting his death sentence thrown out. It didn't work. He was sentenced to death again. But the story doesn't end here. After that sentencing hearing, Thompson was being held at the Harris County Jail in Texas for transfer back to the death row unit at Pulaski Prison. While there for several weeks, he managed to get a hold of an employee's ID, possibly a custodian, that he ended up swiping, and he placed a small photo of himself on the ID. He also made the ID appear to belong to some superior state official. He also got a hold of a handcuff key. To this day, however, nobody knows how he got that key, and he still refuses to tell. On November 3rd of the year 2005, he was scheduled to meet with his lawyer, and he had a bag with his court clothing in the bag. He met with his lawyer in a meeting room at the jailhouse, and when the lawyer stepped out, he made his move. Thompson used the handcuff key to remove his handcuffs. He changed into his court clothing and placed the fake ID on his jacket pocket. He was able to exit the meeting room and walk casually through hallways, going past prison guards. Once reaching the exit, he was required to present his ID to a guard at the door. The guard found everything was in order, and Thompson walked out the door. Thompson then snuck onto the cab of a freight train and didn't get off until he reached the state of Louisiana on November the 5th. Once in Louisiana, He pretended to be from an area near New Orleans and told people that he lost his home and everything when Hurricane Katrina hit on August 29th of that year. People felt so bad for him that they gave him food, drinks, and money. On November 7th, 4 days after his escape, he used some of that money to get drunk. The reports are not very clear on exactly what happened next. Some state that he was acting erratically and was questioned by police, and others say that he was recognized by someone and U.S. Marshals were alerted and he was arrested. He knew the jig was up. When Charles Thompson was asked what his name was by one of the marshals, his reply was, "You know who I am." Please go ahead and hit the subscribe button for more death row and upcoming execution stories so that you're alerted when the next one comes out. Don't forget, you can also follow me on Facebook for updates and more death row news. There will be a link to my Facebook in the description below. My name is Paco Rivera. Thank you for watching. Take care and bye for now.